Some truths refuse to stay buried. They wait in the dark, patient as stone until the right moment arrives, until someone asks the right question, until science catches up with memory, until the weight of silence becomes unbearable. In Orlando, Florida, the summer of 1963 felt like any other summer in a city still finding its identity. The air hung thick with humidity and the scent of orange blossoms drifting in from the groves that still surrounded the downtown core. The heat was relentless, the kind that made asphalt shimmer like water and turned parked cars into ovens by mid-morning. Downtown streets hummed with the steady rhythm of American prosperity. Chevrolet Impalas and Ford Galaxies cruised along Orange Avenue. Women wore white gloves to Sunday services at First Baptist Church. Men tipped their fedoras to passing ladies outside the San Juan Hotel. The city was growing, transforming from a sleepy citrus town into something larger, though no one could quite predict what that would be. Walt Disney had not yet announced his plans for the swampland southwest of town. The Space Coast was just beginning to boom. Orlando existed in a strange liminal space between old Florida and the future. But beneath that polished surface of normalcy, beneath the cheerful facade of progress and prosperity, something terrible was taking shape, something that would haunt the city for more than 6 decades. On June 14, 1963, a Friday, the temperature climbed to 92 degrees by noon. The National Weather Service issued heat advisories. Mothers kept children indoors during the hottest hours. Construction workers sought shade during their lunch breaks. The few air-conditioned establishments downtown became refuges for anyone who could afford a cup of coffee and a seat. Most people sought relief however they could. They lingered in the cool aisles of McCrory's Five and Dime. They sat beneath ceiling fans in the public library. They gathered under the sprawling oaks in Lake Eola Park, watching the swans glide across the water. Catherine Marie Holloway did neither. The 22-year-old waitress finished her morning shift at Rosie's Diner on Church Street at 2:30 that afternoon, just as she did every weekday. She untied her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it in her locker in the back room. She collected her tips from the pocket of her uniform, $6.40 in coins and crumpled bills. She tucked the money into her small white purse. She checked her reflection in the small mirror hanging near the employee entrance. She smoothed her dark hair, which she wore in soft curls that brushed her shoulders. She adjusted the collar of her pale blue dress, the one her mother had made for her birthday. She said goodbye to Rose Kowalski, the diner's owner, a stout Polish woman who treated her employees like family. She waved to Jimmy, the cook, who was already prepping for the dinner rush. She pushed open the back door and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sunlight. 3 people saw her leave the diner that day. 2 of them later told police they remembered her smile, the way she seemed happy, unhurried. One recalled that she was humming a tune, though he couldn't remember which one. No one saw her arrive anywhere else. By midnight, when Catherine still hadn't come home, her mother called the Orlando Police Department. Her voice was tight with fear, though the desk sergeant tried to reassure her. Young women sometimes stayed out late. Maybe she'd gone to a movie with friends. Maybe she'd lost track of time. But Catherine's mother knew her daughter. Catherine was responsible, predictable. She always called if she was going to be late. Always. By dawn on Saturday, uniformed officers were knocking on doors along Church Street, showing Catherine's photograph to shopkeepers and early morning pedestrians. By Sunday afternoon, volunteer search parties were combing the citrus groves east of town, calling her name into the thick, humid air. By Monday morning, the case was already going cold. What happened to Catherine Marie Holloway became one of Orlando's most haunting mysteries, a question that outlived the investigators who first pursued it. A silence that stretched across 6 decades, through the transformation of Orlando from a quiet southern town into a sprawling metropolitan area, through the construction of theme parks and highways, through generations of detectives who inherited the file and promised the family they wouldn't give up, until a discarded cigarette butt and a genealogy database changed everything. This is the story of how the past finally spoke. How science gave voice to the voiceless. How a community learned that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, cannot stay hidden forever. How patience and technology converged to bring justice to a young woman who'd been waiting 61 years for someone to tell her story. This is the story of Catherine Marie Holloway, a waitress who dreamed of becoming a secretary, her daughter who sent money home to help her younger siblings, a girlfriend who wore a promise ring and talked about spring weddings, and this is the story of the man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. The investigation would span 2 centuries, 2 completely different eras of law enforcement. It would outlive witnesses, exhaust detectives, and test the limits of forensic science. It would become a case study in patience, persistence, and the relentless march of technology. It would prove that justice, though sometimes delayed, is not always denied. But in June of 1963, none of that mattered yet. None of that was even imaginable. All that mattered was a young woman who walked out of a diner into the Florida heat and vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The silence that followed would last 61 years, 4 months and 27 days. But silence, as it turns out, is never permanent. Catherine Marie Holloway was born on March 3, 1941, in Kissimmee, Florida, a small town 20 miles south of Orlando. She arrived 3 months before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, in a world that would be unrecognizable by the time she reached adulthood. She was the second of 4 children born to Robert and Eleanor Holloway. Her father worked at a citrus packing plant, spending long hours sorting and boxing oranges destined for markets up north. Her mother took in sewing, mending clothes for neighbors, and occasionally making dresses for special occasions. Money was always tight, but the family never went hungry. Catherine grew up in a 2-bedroom house with a tin roof that drummed during summer thunderstorms. She shared a room with her older sister, Mary, and later with her younger sister, Margaret. Their brother, Robert Jr., slept on a cot in the living room until he was old enough to join the Navy. Neighbors remembered Catherine as a quiet child, thoughtful and observant. She loved to read, spending hours at the small county library. She checked out books about faraway places, about women who did important things. She dreamed of a life beyond Kissimmee, though she never said so out loud. The family moved to Orlando in the summer of 1955, when Catherine was 14. Her father had been offered a supervisor position at a larger packing facility. The pay was better, enough to afford a modest ranch house on Delaney Avenue, in a working-class neighborhood where the houses all looked similar and everyone knew everyone else's business. Catherine attended Colonial High School, a sprawling campus on Colonial Drive. She was a good student, not exceptional but steady. She earned B's in most subjects, as in English. She sang alto in the choir, her voice blending seamlessly with the others. She worked on the yearbook committee, carefully pasting photographs and writing captions. Teachers remembered her as polite and diligent. She never caused trouble. She turned in assignments on time. She raised her hand when she knew the answer, but never showed off. Friends described her as kind, the sort of person who remembered birthdays and offered to help with homework. She wasn't part of the popular crowd, but she wasn't an outcast either. She existed comfortably in the middle, content with a small circle of close friends. She graduated in May 1959, wearing a white cap and gown, clutching her diploma while her mother took photographs with a Brownie camera. She had plans to attend secretarial school downtown, to learn typing and shorthand, to get a job in an office somewhere, maybe at the courthouse, maybe at one of the banks on Orange Avenue. But money was tight that summer. Her father's hours at the packing plant had been cut. The citrus industry was struggling, facing competition from California and disease in the groves. Her younger siblings needed school clothes and supplies. Her brother's Navy pay helped, but it wasn't enough. So Catherine made a decision. She would work for a year, save money, and then enroll in secretarial school. It was just a delay, she told herself, just temporary. She found a job at Rosie's Diner in September 1959. The diner sat on the corner of Church Street and Orange Avenue, a single-story building with large plate-glass windows and a red neon sign that buzzed at night. Inside it was all chrome and formica, with a long counter lined with swivel stools and a row of red vinyl booths along the windows. Rose Kowalski, the owner, was a first-generation Polish immigrant who'd come to America in 1938, just before the war. She'd worked in restaurants in New York before moving to Florida for her health. She opened the diner in 1952 with money she'd saved and a loan from a local bank. Rose hired Catherine on the spot. She liked the girl's quiet demeanor, her clean appearance, the way she looked customers in the eye when she spoke. She started her at 60 cents an hour plus tips. For nearly 4 years, Catherine worked the morning shift, 5 days a week. She arrived at 6 a.m., before the sun had burned off the morning coolness. She tied on her apron, filled the coffee urns, and set out the sugar dispensers and cream pitchers. The regulars arrived like clockwork. Mr. Henderson, who worked at the courthouse, always ordered 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast. Mrs. Palmer, a retired schoolteacher, wanted oatmeal with brown sugar and a pot of tea. The construction workers from the site down the street filled the back booths loud and hungry, ordering stacks of pancakes and bacon. Catherine learned their names, their orders, their stories. She poured coffee without being asked. She remembered who took cream and who drank it black. She laughed at their jokes and listened to their complaints about the heat, the traffic, the state of the world. She was good at her job. Rose gave her a raise after 6 months, then another after a year. The tips were decent, especially on weekends. Catherine saved most of what she earned, keeping the money in a coffee can hidden in her closet. She still planned to go to secretarial school, but the timing never seemed right. Her father's hours remained unpredictable. Her younger sister needed dental work. The house needed a new roof. There was always something. Catherine didn't complain. She was patient. She believed her time would come. In October 1962, she met Thomas Garrett at a church social. He was 24, tall and lean, with dark hair and an easy smile. He worked as a mechanic at a garage on Colonial Drive, coming home each night with grease under his fingernails and stories about the cars he'd fixed. They started dating. He took her to the movies at the Beecham Theatre downtown. They ate dinner at Morrison's cafeteria. They walked around Lake Eola on Sunday afternoons, feeding the swans and talking about the future. At Christmas, Thomas gave her a promise ring, a small silver band with a tiny chip of a diamond. He told her he was saving for a real engagement ring. He talked about getting married, maybe in the spring of 1964. They could rent a small apartment. She could keep working until they had children. Catherine wore the ring every day. She showed it to her mother, to her friends at the diner. She allowed herself to imagine a different future, one that included a husband and a home of her own. She was happy. Not ecstatically, not dramatically, but in the quiet, steady way that comes from feeling secure and loved. On the morning of June 14, 1963, Catherine woke at 5:15, just as she did every weekday. She dressed in her pale blue uniform, the one her mother had made from a Simplicity pattern. She ate a piece of toast standing at the kitchen counter while her mother packed her lunch, a ham sandwich, and an apple. She caught the 6:20 bus on Orange Avenue. The driver, Mr. Willis, nodded at her. She took her usual seat near the middle. The ride downtown took 15 minutes. At Rosie's diner, the morning unfolded like any other. Catherine tied on her apron, filled the coffee urns, and greeted the early customers. Mr. Henderson arrived at 6:45, Mrs. Palmer at 7:10, the construction workers at 7:30. She took orders, delivered plates, refilled coffee cups. She chatted with a businessman about his weekend fishing trip. She complimented Mrs. Palmer's new hat. She laughed when one of the construction workers told a joke about a talking parrot. Rose Kowalski later told police that Catherine seemed completely normal that day, happy even. She hummed while she worked, some tune Rose didn't recognize. She talked about going to the beach with Thomas on Sunday. At 2:30, Catherine clocked out. She untied her apron and hung it in her locker. She collected her tips, counting them carefully, $6.40. She folded the bills and tucked them into her white purse along with the coins. She checked her reflection in the small mirror. She smoothed her hair. She applied a fresh coat of lipstick, a pale pink shade called Summer Rose. She said goodbye to Rose, who was reviewing invoices at a table near the kitchen. She waved to Jimmy, who was chopping onions for the evening's meatloaf special. She pushed open the back door and stepped out into the afternoon heat. The temperature had climbed to 92 degrees. The sun was blinding. The air felt thick enough to swim through. Catherine turned left, heading toward Orange Avenue where she would catch the 2:50 bus home. She never made it. The bus stop was exactly 2 blocks away from Rosie's diner. Catherine had walked that route hundreds of times, maybe thousands. 2 blocks east on Church Street, then north half a block to the covered bus shelter on Orange Avenue. In normal circumstances, at a normal pace, the walk took less than 3 minutes. The 2:50 bus was rarely late. Mr. Willis, the driver, prided himself on punctuality. He departed at 2:50 exactly, whether passengers were running for the stop or not. Catherine knew this, she was never late. But when the 2:50 bus pulled away from the curb that Friday afternoon, Catherine Holloway wasn't on it. Mr. Willis didn't think anything of it. Passengers missed buses all the time. Maybe she'd stayed late at work, maybe she'd decided to walk, maybe she'd caught a ride with someone. At the Holloway house on Delaney Avenue, Eleanor Holloway wasn't worried at first. Catherine sometimes stayed late to help Rose with inventory or to cover for another waitress. She'd done it before. She always called if she was going to be significantly delayed, but sometimes she was just 30 minutes or an hour late. Eleanor went about her afternoon routine. She folded laundry. She started preparing dinner, peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink. She glanced at the clock occasionally, but didn't feel any real concern. By 5 o'clock, she expected Catherine to walk through the door any moment. By 6 o'clock, she felt the first flutter of unease. By 7 o'clock, that unease had transformed into something sharper, something that sat heavy in her chest and made it difficult to breathe properly. Robert Holloway came home from the packing plant at 6:30, tired and covered in a fine layer of citrus dust. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and asked where Catherine was. Eleanor told him she didn't know. She'd called Rosie's diner twice. No answer. The diner closed at 3 on Fridays. Rose had probably gone home. Robert tried to reassure his wife. Catherine was 22 years old. She was responsible. She probably had a good reason for being late. Maybe she'd gone shopping with a friend. Maybe she'd stopped at the library. But even as he said these things, he felt his own worry growing. By 8 o'clock, Robert called Thomas Garrett. The mechanic answered on the 3rd ring. No, he hadn't seen Catherine. They'd made plans for Saturday, not today. He'd been at the garage all day working on a transmission. Thomas heard the worry in Robert's voice. He told him to hang on. He'd drive around and look for her. Thomas got in his truck and drove to Rosie's diner. The lights were off, the door was locked. The closed sign hung in the window. He cupped his hands against the glass and peered inside. Empty. He drove to McCrory's Five and Dime, thinking maybe Catherine had stopped to buy something. The store was closed. He drove to the public library, closed. He drove to Lake Eola Park, circling slowly, scanning the paths and benches. Nothing. He drove back to the Holloway house. Robert and Eleanor were standing on the front porch, waiting. Thomas shook his head. At 11:40 p.m., Eleanor Holloway called the Orlando Police Department. Her hands shook as she dialed. Her voice cracked when the dispatcher answered. Officer Raymond Duluth took the report. He was young, only 26, still learning the rhythms of police work. He asked the standard questions, filling out the form with careful handwriting. Name. Age. Physical description. Last known location. Last seen wearing. He asked if Catherine had any history of running away, any problems at home, any reason she might want to disappear. Eleanor answered no to everything. Catherine was happy. She had a boyfriend. She had plans. She wouldn't just leave. Officer Duluth told the family what he'd been trained to say. Most missing persons cases resolved themselves within 24 hours. Young people sometimes stayed out late without telling their parents. It was probably nothing to worry about, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. He filed the report and passed it to the Detective Bureau. By Saturday morning, the Orlando Police Department had mobilized a response. Detective Frank Callahan, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness, caught the case. He read through Duluth's report, then drove to the Holloway house to interview the family himself. Eleanor Holloway looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her hands twisted a dish towel as she answered Callahan's questions. Catherine was a good girl, responsible, reliable. She'd never done anything like this before. Something was wrong. A mother knows. Callahan believed her. He'd worked enough missing persons cases to recognize the difference between a runaway and something more sinister. This felt like something more sinister. He drove to Rosie's diner and interviewed Rose Kowalski. The owner was distraught, wringing her hands and speaking in a mixture of English and Polish. Catherine had seemed fine yesterday, normal, happy. She'd left at 2:30, same as always. Callahan interviewed Jimmy, the cook, same story. Nothing unusual. Catherine had been humming while she worked. He interviewed the regular customers, tracking them down at their homes and workplaces. Mr. Henderson from the courthouse, Mrs. Palmer, the retired teacher, the construction workers. Everyone said the same thing. Catherine seemed normal, happy, nothing out of the ordinary. Callahan canvassed Church Street, going door to door, questioning shopkeepers and business owners. Had anyone seen a young woman in a blue dress yesterday afternoon? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? A woman who worked at a dress shop thought she might have seen someone matching Catherine's description, walking east on Church Street around 2:45, but she couldn't be certain. It might have been someone else. A gas station attendant on the corner of Church and Huey told Callahan he'd seen a young woman getting into a car around that time, but he hadn't paid much attention. He didn't see the driver's face, didn't catch the license plate. The car was dark-colored, maybe blue, maybe black, maybe dark green, he couldn't be sure. Callahan pressed him for details. What kind of car? Sedan? Coupe? The attendant shrugged. Just a car. Nothing special, nothing that stood out. It wasn't much, but it was something. It suggested Catherine might have accepted a ride from someone. But who and why? By Sunday morning, the story had hit the newspapers. The Orlando Sentinel ran Catherine's photograph on the front page, a school picture from her senior year. She looked younger than 22, her smile shy and hopeful. The headline read, "Local waitress missing. Family fears foul play." The article included a description and a plea for information. Anyone who'd seen Catherine or knew anything about her disappearance was urged to contact the police. The phone lines at the police station lit up. Tips poured in from all over Central Florida. A woman in Sanford thought she'd seen Catherine at the Greyhound bus station. A man in Daytona Beach claimed she was working at a beachfront motel. A psychic in Tampa called to say she'd had a vision of Catherine near water. Every tip was logged. Every lead was investigated. Detectives drove to Sanford, to Daytona Beach, to Tampa. They showed Catherine's photograph. They asked questions. Every lead turned out to be nothing. Mistaken identity, wishful thinking, attention-seeking. By Sunday afternoon, volunteers had organized search parties. Dozens of people, neighbors and strangers alike, gathered at Lake Eola Park. They divided into groups and fanned out across the city. They searched vacant lots and abandoned buildings. They walked the shores of lakes and retention ponds. They combed the orange groves east of town, calling Catherine's name into the thick, humid air. They found nothing. Thomas Garrett barely slept. He drove around the city at all hours, searching places the police might have missed. He checked alleys and parking lots. He talked to homeless people living under bridges. He showed Catherine's photograph to anyone who would look. He found nothing. By the end of the first week, the case had stalled. Detectives had interviewed dozens of people. They'd followed up on hundreds of tips. They'd searched miles of terrain, but they had no witnesses, no evidence, and no body. Catherine Holloway had simply vanished, as completely as if she'd been erased from existence. And then on July 3rd, 1963, 19 days after Catherine disappeared, a hunter found something in the woods. The discovery came on a Wednesday morning, hot and still, the kind of day when even the insects seemed too exhausted to move. Earl Simmons was a local hunter, a man in his 50s who'd spent his entire life in Central Florida. He knew the woods and swamps better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. He could track deer through palmetto scrub. He could identify bird calls by sound alone. He understood the rhythms of the wilderness. He was tracking a buck that morning in a wooded area off Curry Ford Road, about 7 miles southeast of downtown Orlando. The land was undeveloped, a tangle of pine trees, palmetto and scrub oak. It wasn't a place people went unless they had a specific reason. No trails, no roads, just wilderness. Simmons had been following the deer's tracks for about 20 minutes when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something wrong carried on the breeze. But as he moved deeper into the woods, the smell grew stronger. Sweet and rotten. Unmistakable. Simmons had hunted long enough to know what death smelled like. He'd field-dressed hundreds of deer. He'd come across dead animals in various states of decay. But this was different. This wasn't an animal. He found her in a shallow depression beneath a stand of pine trees, about 50 yards from the nearest dirt road. She was partially covered with leaves and branches, a hasty attempt at concealment that had been disturbed by animals and weather. Simmons didn't get close. He didn't need to. He could see enough from where he stood. The pale blue fabric, the dark hair, the unnatural stillness. He turned and ran back to his truck, his heart pounding. He drove to the nearest gas station, a small Texaco on Curry Ford Road, and called the police from the payphone outside. By noon, the scene was swarming with law enforcement. Uniformed officers established a perimeter. Detectives documented everything. A photographer took pictures from every angle. The medical examiner arrived in a black station wagon. Detective Frank Callahan stood at the edge of the scene, watching the organized chaos unfold. He'd been expecting this moment, dreading it, since Catherine Holloway had first disappeared. He'd hoped she'd be found alive, but he'd known the odds. The body was badly decomposed. 19 days in the Florida heat had taken their toll. The humidity, the insects, the animals. Nature had done its work. But the pale blue dress was still recognizable. So were the pearl earrings, small and delicate, still in place. And there was a ring on her left hand, a simple silver band with a tiny diamond. Catherine's father, Robert Holloway, was brought to the scene to make an identification. Callahan tried to prepare him, tried to explain what he would see, but there was no way to truly prepare someone for that moment. Robert stood at the edge of the depression, staring down at what remained of his daughter. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, confirming what everyone already knew. The medical examiner, Dr. Harold Winters, conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before the body was transported to the morgue. He noted the advanced decomposition, the evidence of animal activity, the position of the body. The full autopsy was conducted the following day. Dr. Winters worked methodically, documenting every detail, taking samples, making measurements. Cause of death, manual strangulation. The hyoid bone in her throat was fractured. There was bruising on her neck, visible despite the decomposition. The pattern suggested she'd been choked from behind, the killer's hands wrapped around her throat. There were defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, scratches, bruises. She'd fought. She'd tried to get away. Dr. Winters found no evidence of sexual assault. Her clothing, though disturbed by decomposition and animals, appeared to be intact. There were no obvious signs of trauma beyond the strangulation. Her white purse was missing. So was the $6.40 in tips she'd collected that day. The working theory emerged quickly. Robbery, a crime of opportunity. Someone had seen a young woman walking alone, had seen an easy target. Maybe they'd offered her a ride, maybe they'd forced her into a car. Either way, it had ended in violence. But who? Detective Callahan assembled a task force. 6 detectives working full-time on the case. They re-interviewed everyone who'd been questioned during the initial missing persons investigation. They expanded the search radius, looking for anyone who might have seen something, anything on June 14th. They pulled records on every known criminal in Orange County, burglars, robbers, men with histories of violence against women. They created a list of potential suspects and started working through it systematically. There was a drifter who'd been spotted panhandling near Church Street in early June. Detectives tracked him to Jacksonville and brought him in for questioning. He had an alibi. He'd been in jail in Duval County on June 14th, arrested for public intoxication. There was a recently paroled burglar named Dennis Kowalski, no relation to Rose. He had a history of violence, including an assault charge from 1959. Detectives questioned him extensively. He claimed he'd been at work at a construction site on June 14th. His foreman confirmed it, though the records were incomplete. There was a gas station attendant named Michael Brennan, who'd been fired from his job in May for stealing from the register. He had a record for assault from 1961. He'd been working at a different gas station on Church Street in June. Detectives brought him in. He was nervous, evasive, but his alibi checked out. Multiple witnesses placed him at work during the relevant time period. Each potential suspect was investigated thoroughly. Each had some weakness in their alibi, some reason to be suspicious, but none of them could be definitively connected to Catherine's murder. The forensic evidence was frustratingly limited. This was 1963. DNA analysis didn't exist. Fingerprinting was useful only if you had a suspect to compare prints against. The crime scene had been compromised by weather, animals, and time, but detectives collected what they could. They bagged fiber samples from Catherine's dress. They took soil samples from the scene. They collected a cigarette butt that had been found about 10 feet from the body, partially buried in pine needles. The cigarette was a Pall Mall, a popular brand. Millions of people smoked Pall Malls. Without a suspect, it meant nothing. They dusted the area for fingerprints but found nothing usable. The heat and humidity had degraded any prints that might have been left behind. They searched for tire tracks on the dirt road nearby, but found dozens of overlapping tracks. The road was used by hunters, teenagers looking for privacy, and people dumping trash. Impossible to isolate which tracks, if any, belonged to the killer. Weeks turned into months. The investigation consumed Detective Callahan. He worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer. He brought the case file home at night, spreading photographs and reports across his dining room table. He dreamed about Catherine, about the moment she realized she was going to die. His wife worried about him. His captain urged him to take a break, to work other cases. But Callahan couldn't let go. He felt responsible. He'd promised Catherine's family he would find who did this. By December 1963, the case was officially classified as unsolved. The active investigation was scaled back. The task force was disbanded. Detectives returned to their regular caseloads. The file, now several inches thick with reports and photographs and dead-end leads, was placed in a cabinet in the Detective Bureau. Case number 632847, Holloway, Catherine Marie, homicide, unsolved. Detective Callahan continued to work the case on his own time. He followed up on tips that came in sporadically. He re-interviewed witnesses, hoping someone would remember something new. He drove out to Curry Ford Road sometimes, standing at the spot where Catherine had been found, trying to understand what had happened. He never solved it. He retired in 1978, after 28 years with the Orlando Police Department. He'd closed dozens of cases during his career. He'd put murderers and rapists and armed robbers behind bars. But the one case he couldn't solve haunted him. He died in 1995 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Orlando Sentinel mentioned his distinguished career in law enforcement. It didn't mention Catherine Holloway, but his family knew. They knew he'd carried that failure with him until the end. The case file remained in the cabinet, gathering dust. New detectives came and went. The city grew and changed. Orlando transformed from a quiet southern town into a sprawling metropolis. Theme parks rose from the swampland. Highways cut through the orange groves. The downtown that Catherine had known was demolished and rebuilt. But the file remained, a reminder, a question without an answer. The silence deepened. Time has a way of erasing things. Memories fade, details blur, certainties become doubts. Witnesses die or move away or simply forget. Evidence deteriorates, degraded by heat and humidity and the simple passage of years. The urgency that once drove an investigation dissipates like morning fog, replaced by newer crimes, fresher tragedies, more pressing demands. By the 1980s, Catherine Holloway's case was ancient history. The detectives who'd worked it were retired or dead. The witnesses had scattered. The physical evidence sat in a storage room in the basement of the police station, untouched and largely forgotten. Orlando had changed beyond recognition. The quiet downtown where Catherine had worked was now a canyon of glass and steel towers. The orange groves had been paved over for subdivisions and shopping malls. Interstate 4 cut through the heart of the city. Walt Disney World had transformed the entire region, bringing millions of tourists and fundamentally altering the character of Central Florida. The Orlando that Catherine had known existed only in old photographs and fading memories. Catherine's family aged and diminished. Her mother, Eleanor, died in 1979 of a heart attack. She was 62. Friends said she'd never recovered from losing Catherine, that the grief had hollowed her out from the inside. She'd spent 16 years waiting for answers that never came. Her father, Robert, followed in 1983. Cancer. He was 67. He'd continued working at the packing plant until his body wouldn't let him anymore. He'd never talked much about Catherine after the funeral, but everyone knew he thought about her constantly. Her older sister, Mary, had moved to Georgia in 1970. She rarely came back to Orlando. Too many painful memories. Her brother, Robert Jr., had stayed in the Navy, making a career of it. He retired as a chief petty officer in 1985 and settled in Virginia Beach. He sent Christmas cards but rarely visited. That left Margaret, Catherine's younger sister. She'd been only 16 when Catherine disappeared. She was 53 now, living in the same house on Delaney Avenue where they'd grown up. She'd never married. She worked as a secretary at an insurance company. Margaret carried the weight of Catherine's memory alone. She kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings from 1963. She had Catherine's high school yearbook, her choir program, her promise ring that Thomas Garrett had returned after the funeral. Every year on Catherine's birthday, March 3rd, Margaret called the Orlando Police Department. She asked if there were any updates, any new leads, any progress. The answer was always the same. "No, ma'am. We haven't forgotten. We're still looking. We'll call if anything changes." But nothing ever changed. In 1995, the Orlando Police Department began a massive project to digitize old case files. It was partly about modernization, partly about saving space. The basement storage rooms were overflowing with decades of paper records. Catherine's file was scanned and uploaded to a database. Every report, every photograph, every witness statement. It was a bureaucratic process, conducted by civilian employees who had no personal connection to the cases they were digitizing. No one expected it to lead anywhere. It was just record-keeping, preservation. In 2003, the department created a dedicated cold case unit. 2 detectives were assigned to review unsolved homicides, focusing on cases where new forensic techniques might provide answers. They had limited resources and hundreds of cases to choose from. Catherine's file was one of many. Detective Lisa Moreno pulled the file in 2004. She was 38, a 12-year veteran of the department. She'd grown up in Orlando, though she'd been born years after Catherine's murder. She'd heard about the case vaguely, the way you hear about local legends. She read through the digitized reports, studying the photographs, reviewing the evidence inventory. She was struck by how little the original investigators had to work with. No witnesses, no physical evidence linking anyone to the crime. Just a body and a lot of unanswered questions. But forensic science had advanced dramatically since 1963. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations. Cases that had been unsolvable were now being closed with genetic evidence. Moreno requested the physical evidence from storage. It took 3 weeks to locate everything. The evidence had been moved several times over the decades, shuffled from one storage facility to another, but most of it was still there. The fiber samples, the soil samples, and the cigarette butt sealed in a paper evidence envelope, labeled in Detective Callahan's careful handwriting. Moreno submitted the cigarette butt to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. The technology had advanced to the point where DNA could be extracted from saliva residue, even decades-old samples. The lab worked on it for 6 weeks. The sample was degraded, contaminated by time and improper storage conditions. But the technicians were skilled. They managed to extract a partial DNA profile. Male, Caucasian. That was all they could determine. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was more than Detective Callahan had ever had. Moreno entered the profile into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crimes. No matches. She filed a detailed report and moved on to the next case. There were dozens more waiting. She couldn't spend all her time on one unsolved murder from 1963. The years passed. The DNA profile sat in the database, waiting. technology continued to advance. Forensic genealogy emerged as a powerful new tool. Investigators began using public genealogy databases to identify suspects through their relatives' DNA. The Golden State Killer was caught this way in 2018. Then dozens of other cold cases were solved. But Orlando's cold case unit was understaffed and underfunded. They couldn't pursue every case with genetic genealogy. They had to prioritize. Catherine's case remained in the queue. Margaret Holloway continued her annual phone calls. She was in her 70s now, her voice thin and tired. She asked the same questions she'd been asking for decades. The detectives who answered were always polite. They assured her the case hadn't been forgotten. They promised to call if anything changed. Margaret didn't really believe them anymore. She'd heard the same promises too many times, but she kept calling anyway. It was the only thing she could do for her sister. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down much of the world. The cold case unit was temporarily disbanded, detectives reassigned to patrol duties. Non-essential work was postponed indefinitely. Catherine's case sat untouched for 2 years. But in 2022, as the world slowly returned to normal, the cold case unit was reconstituted. Detective Marcus Webb, a 15-year veteran, was put in charge. He was given a small budget and a mandate to pursue cases using genetic genealogy. He reviewed the backlog of unsolved homicides. He created a priority list based on several factors: the quality of DNA evidence, the age of the case, the likelihood of success. Catherine Holloway's case made the list. In January 2024, 61 years after Catherine's murder, Detective Webb contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The breakthrough was finally coming. The science that would finally solve Catherine Holloway's murder didn't exist when she died. It didn't exist when Detective Callahan retired. It didn't even exist when the DNA profile was first extracted in 2004. Forensic genetic genealogy emerged in the 2010s, combining traditional forensic DNA analysis with the explosion of consumer genealogy databases. Millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to websites like Ancestry and 23andMe, hoping to learn about their heritage or find distant relatives. What they'd inadvertently created was the largest genetic database in human history, and law enforcement had figured out how to use it. In January 2024, Detective Marcus Webb sent Catherine's DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs. The company had solved dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy. Their process was methodical and time-consuming, but it worked. Parabon's genealogists uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where users voluntarily share their genetic information for genealogical research. Unlike commercial databases, GEDmatch allowed law enforcement access. Within 2 weeks they had a hit, not a direct match, but a distant relative, a third cousin, according to the genetic markers. Someone who shared a common ancestor with the person who'd left DNA on that cigarette butt in 1963. From there, the genealogists began building a family tree. They worked backwards from the third cousin, identifying common ancestors. Then they worked forward, tracing all the descendants of those ancestors. It was painstaking work requiring access to birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data. They built the tree branch by branch, generation by generation. They identified dozens of potential suspects, then narrowed the list based on age, location, and other factors. By March, they had a name: Robert Eugene Marsh. Detective Webb pulled everything he could find on Marsh. He was 79 years old, born in 1945 in Sanford, Florida. He'd lived in Central Florida his entire life. He'd attended Seminole High School, graduating in 1963. In June of 1963, Robert Marsh had been 18 years old. Webb dug deeper. Marsh had worked various jobs over the years: deliveryman, warehouse worker, truck driver. He'd married in 1968, divorced in 1975, married again in 1980. That marriage had lasted until his second wife died in 2019. He had 2 children from his first marriage, both living out of state. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket in the past 20 years. He lived in a retirement community in Claremont, Florida, about 25 miles west of Orlando. He played golf twice a week. He attended a Methodist church on Sundays. He volunteered at a local food bank. By all appearances, Robert Eugene Marsh was a harmless old man living a quiet retirement. But Detective Webb knew appearances could be deceiving. The problem was evidence. The genetic genealogy had identified Marsh as a potential suspect, but it wasn't proof. Webb needed a direct DNA sample to confirm the match. And he couldn't compel Marsh to provide one without probable cause. So Webb waited and watched. In April, he and his team conducted surveillance. They followed Marsh to the grocery store, to his doctor's appointments, to the golf course. They documented his routine, looking for an opportunity. The opportunity came on April 23rd, a Tuesday morning. Marsh drove to a Starbucks near his retirement community. He ordered a grande latte and a blueberry muffin. He sat at an outdoor table reading the newspaper on his tablet. He ate his muffin. He sipped his coffee. Then he pulled out a pack of cigarettes, Pall Malls, the same brand found at the crime scene in 1963. He smoked slowly, watching the traffic pass. When he finished, he stubbed out the cigarette and tossed it into a nearby trash can. Webb waited until Marsh drove away. Then he retrieved the cigarette butt, carefully placing it in an evidence bag. The DNA sample was sent to the lab with a rush request. Webb knew this was it. This would either confirm Marsh as the killer or eliminate him as a suspect. The results came back on May 15th. It was a match. The DNA from the 2024 cigarette butt matched the DNA from the 1963 crime scene. Robert Eugene Marsh had killed Catherine Holloway. Webb spent the next 3 weeks building his case. He reviewed Marsh's background again, looking for any connection to Catherine. He found it in old employment records. In June 1963, Marsh had been working for a delivery company that serviced businesses in downtown Orlando, including Rosie's Diner. Webb obtained a warrant for Marsh's arrest. On June 10, 2024, exactly 61 years and 4 days after Catherine Holloway disappeared, Webb and a team of officers arrived at Marsh's home. It was 7:30 in the morning. Marsh answered the door in a bathrobe and slippers. He looked confused when Webb showed him the badge and warrant. Webb identified himself. He explained why they were there. He read Marsh his rights. Marsh didn't say anything. He just stood there staring, his face pale and expressionless. They arrested him without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there, silent, as they handcuffed him and led him to the patrol car. At the police station, Marsh was processed and placed in an interrogation room. Webb let him sit there for an hour, giving him time to think, to worry, to understand the gravity of his situation. Then Webb entered the room carrying a thick file folder. He sat down across from Marsh and opened the folder, spreading photographs across the table. Catherine's high school picture, the crime scene photos, the autopsy report. Marsh looked at the photographs. His hands trembled slightly. Webb laid out the evidence, the DNA match, the employment records, the timeline. He spoke calmly, methodically, building the case piece by piece. Marsh sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. He didn't ask for a lawyer, he didn't deny anything, he just listened. After an hour, Webb asked the question directly. "Did you kill Catherine Holloway?" Marsh was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd gotten away with it." The confession came slowly, reluctantly, like water seeping through cracked stone. Robert Eugene Marsh sat in the interrogation room, his hands still folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the photographs of Catherine Holloway. The young woman in the pictures had been dead for 61 years. Marsh had lived an entire lifetime since that June afternoon. Detective Marcus Webb waited. He'd learned patience over his 15 years in law enforcement. He knew when to push and when to let silence do the work. Finally, Marsh spoke again. "I was 18, he said. His voice was thin, aged, nothing like the voice of the young man who'd committed murder in 1963. "I was just a kid. I didn't mean for it to happen." Webb didn't respond. He let Marsh continue. "I was making deliveries that day, restaurant supplies. I'd been to that diner before, Rosie's. I knew the waitress, the one with the dark hair. She was always nice to me. Always smiled. Marsh paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. I saw her leaving the diner that afternoon. It was hot, so hot. I was in the delivery truck, heading back to the warehouse. I saw her walking. I pulled over. I offered her a ride. Webb made notes but didn't interrupt. She said no at first. She said she was going to catch the bus, but I told her it was too hot to walk. I told her I was heading that direction anyway. I was just being nice. That's all it was supposed to be. Marsh's hands unfolded, then folded again. A nervous gesture. She got in the truck. She sat by the window. She had her purse in her lap. We talked about the heat, about work, normal things. I wasn't planning anything, I swear I wasn't. Webb watched Marsh's face. The old man's eyes were distant, seeing something from 6 decades ago. I don't know what happened. I saw her purse. I knew waitresses carried their tips. I'd been having money problems. My father had lost his job. We were behind on rent. I just thought, maybe if I could get some money, just a little bit, it would help. The justifications of a killer, Webb thought. The same rationalizations he'd heard in dozens of interrogations. I pulled off onto a side road. She asked what I was doing. I told her I needed to check something with the truck. She started to get nervous. I could see it in her face. She reached for the door handle. Marsh's voice dropped even lower. I grabbed her purse. She fought me. She was stronger than I thought. She was screaming. I panicked. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I put my hands around her neck. I just wanted her to be quiet. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. When she stopped moving, I realized what I'd done. I was terrified. I drove deeper into the woods. I carried her into the trees. I covered her with branches and leaves. I took her purse. There was only $6 in it. $6. Marsh's voice cracked. I threw the purse in a dumpster behind a grocery store. I went home. I told myself it was an accident. I told myself I hadn't meant to kill her. I told myself that if I just acted normal, no one would ever know. Webb let the silence stretch for a moment, then asked, "Did anyone ever suspect you?" Marsh shook his head. "The police questioned everyone who worked for the delivery company. They questioned me too. I told them I'd been making deliveries all day. I showed them my route sheet. They never asked me again." "And you never told anyone?" "Never. Not my wife, not my children, not anyone. I buried it. I tried to forget." "Did you forget?" Webb asked. Marsh looked up, meeting Webb's eyes for the first time. "No. I thought about her every day, every single day for 61 years. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and signed. Marsh was formally charged with first-degree murder. His bail was set at $1 million, which he couldn't pay. He was transferred to the Orange County Jail to await trial. The news broke the following morning. The Orlando Sentinel ran it as the front-page story. Cold case solved after 61 years. Arrest made in 1963. Murder of Orlando waitress. The story went national within hours. CNN, NBC, ABC, all the major networks picked it up. It had everything the media loved. A decades-old mystery, cutting-edge forensic science, a seemingly ordinary man hiding a terrible secret. Detective Webb held a press conference at police headquarters. He stood at a podium, flanked by the police chief and the state attorney. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Webb explained the investigation, the genetic genealogy, the DNA match. He praised the work of Parabon Nanolabs and the dedication of the Cold Case Unit. He thanked the community for never forgetting Catherine Holloway, but the person Webb most wanted to talk to wasn't in the press room. That afternoon, he drove to the house on Delaney Avenue. Margaret Holloway still lived there in the same small ranch house where Catherine had grown up. She was 77 now, her hair white, her movements slow. Webb had called ahead. She was waiting on the front porch when he arrived. She stood as he approached, her hand gripping the porch railing for support. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. Not yet. She'd been waiting 61 years for this moment. Webb climbed the steps slowly. He'd delivered news to families before, both good and bad, but this felt different. This was history closing a circle. "Ms. Holloway," he said gently, "may I sit with you?" She nodded and lowered herself back into her chair. Webb sat beside her. "We got him," Webb said simply. "The man who killed your sister. His name is Robert Eugene Marsh. He confessed this morning." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. She stared straight ahead, looking at the street where Catherine had walked to catch the bus all those mornings. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything." Webb did. He explained the genetic genealogy, the surveillance, the DNA match, the confession. He told her about the delivery truck, the side road, the $6. He left nothing out. She deserved the truth, all of it. When he finished, Margaret was silent for a long time. A car passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere in the neighborhood. Life continued, indifferent to the weight of the moment. 61 years, Margaret finally said. "My mother died not knowing. My father died not knowing. I'm the only one left." "I'm sorry it took so long," Webb said. Margaret turned to look at him. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice was steady. "Don't apologize. You found him. After all this time, you found him. Catherine can rest now. We all can." She reached over and took Webb's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not forgetting her." The trial began on March 3, 2025, what would have been Catherine's 84th birthday. The timing was coincidental, but it felt appropriate somehow. Robert Eugene Marsh pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His attorney had advised him that fighting the charges was pointless. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The confession was recorded and signed. A trial would only prolong the inevitable. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morales. She'd been born 5 years after Catherine's murder. She'd grown up in Orlando, in a city transformed by time and progress. But she understood the weight of history in her courtroom. The sentencing hearing was brief. The state attorney presented the facts of the case. Marsh's attorney argued for leniency based on his client's age and his otherwise law-abiding life. Margaret Holloway was given the opportunity to address the court. She walked slowly to the podium, her hands clutching a piece of paper covered in handwritten notes. "My sister Catherine was 22 years old when she died," Margaret began, her voice wavering but determined. "She was kind and hard-working. She sang in the choir, she saved her money, she dreamed of a better life." She paused, gathering strength. "Robert Marsh took all of that away. He took her life for $6. He took my mother's peace. He took my father's joy. He took 61 years of justice." Margaret looked directly at Marsh, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed. "But he didn't take her memory. We never forgot Catherine. We never stopped loving her. And now finally the world knows what happened to her. The silence is broken." She folded her paper and returned to her seat. Judge Morales sentenced Robert Eugene Marsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age, it was effectively a death sentence. He would die behind bars. Marsh showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the suit he'd worn to court. He would be transferred to a state prison facility designed for elderly inmates. He would spend his remaining days in a cell, with nothing but his memories and his guilt. The media coverage continued for weeks. The case became a symbol of how far forensic science had come, how cold cases that once seemed unsolvable could now be cracked with genetic genealogy and persistence. Other police departments reached out to the Orlando Cold Case Unit, asking for advice on their own unsolved murders. Parabon Nanolabs saw an increase in requests from law enforcement agencies across the country. Catherine's story inspired a documentary, a podcast and countless news articles. Her photograph, the one from her high school yearbook, appeared on screens and pages around the world. But for Margaret Holloway, the media attention was secondary. What mattered was the closure, the answer to the question that had haunted her family for 6 decades. On a warm afternoon in April 2025, Margaret visited Greenwood Cemetery on the east side of Orlando. She walked slowly along the paved paths, past rows of headstones marking lives lived and lost. She stopped at a simple granite marker. Catherine Marie Holloway, 1941 to 1963, beloved daughter and sister. Margaret knelt beside the grave, her knees protesting the movement. She placed a bouquet of white roses on the grass. "It's over, Catherine," she said softly. "We found him. You can rest now. The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang. The world continued its endless turning. Margaret stayed there for a long time, talking to her sister, telling her about the investigation, about Detective Webb, about the trial. She told her that she'd been remembered, that she'd mattered, that her life hadn't been forgotten. When she finally stood to leave, her legs stiff and her eyes wet with tears, she felt something she hadn't felt in 61 years. Peace. Detective Marcus Webb continued working cold cases. Catherine's case had reinvigorated the unit, bringing attention and funding. He had a list of unsolved murders stretching back decades, each one representing a life cut short, a family left without answers. He thought about Catherine often. Her photograph sat on his desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. Justice delayed was not justice denied, not if you refused to give up. The case had taught him something important. Time might erode evidence and fade memories, but it couldn't erase the truth. Science and persistence could reach across decades, could give voice to the voiceless, could bring light to the darkest corners of the past. Robert Eugene Marsh died in prison on November 12, 2026, 18 months after his conviction. He was 81 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. His obituary in the local newspaper was brief. It mentioned his children and grandchildren. It mentioned his years working in delivery and logistics. It mentioned in the final paragraph his conviction for the 1963 murder of Catherine Holloway. There was no funeral. His children, who'd been shocked and devastated by their father's arrest, chose not to hold a service. His body was cremated. His ashes were not claimed. Margaret Holloway read the obituary online. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no relief, just emptiness. Marsh's death didn't change anything. Catherine was still gone. The years were still lost. But the truth had been told. That mattered. In the years that followed, Catherine's case became a teaching tool. It was studied in criminal justice programs, analyzed in forensic science courses, discussed in law enforcement conferences. It represented both the limitations of 1960s investigative techniques and the power of modern forensic genealogy. The Orlando Police Department created a memorial wall in their headquarters honoring victims of unsolved homicides. Catherine's photograph was placed there, along with dozens of others. A small plaque beneath her picture read, Catherine Marie Holloway, 1941-1963. Justice delayed, not denied. Detective Frank Callahan, who'd worked the case in 1963 and carried the failure with him until his death, was posthumously recognized for his thorough documentation and evidence preservation. Without his meticulous work, the case could never have been solved decades later. Margaret Holloway lived to see her 82nd birthday. She remained in the house on Delaney Avenue, surrounded by memories of her sister. She kept the scrapbook, the photographs, the newspaper clippings. She added new articles about the arrest, the trial, the conviction. She died peacefully in her sleep on a January night in 2029. She was found by a neighbor who'd come to check on her. On her nightstand was a photograph of Catherine, smiling in her choir robe. Margaret was buried beside her sister in Greenwood Cemetery. The headstone read, Margaret Ann Holloway, 1947 to 2029. She never forgot. The house on Delaney Avenue was sold to a young family. They knew nothing of its history, of the girl who'd once lived there and dreamed of a better future. They painted the walls, updated the kitchen, and filled the rooms with the sounds of children playing. Life continued. The city grew, the past receded. But Catherine's story remained. It lived in police files and court records, in documentary films and true crime podcasts, in the memories of those who'd known her and those who'd worked to find her killer. It served as a reminder that every victim matters, that every case deserves to be solved, that time and silence cannot bury the truth forever. On June 14th each year, Detective Webb visited Catherine's grave. He brought white roses and stood in silence for a few minutes. It was a private ritual, a way of honoring not just Catherine but all the victims whose cases remained unsolved. He thought about the cigarette butt that had waited 61 years to tell its story. He thought about the technology that hadn't existed when Catherine died but had ultimately brought her justice. He thought about the fragile chain of evidence and memory that had survived long enough to matter. And he thought about silence, about how it could be broken even after decades, about how truth had a way of emerging no matter how deeply it was buried. The case of Catherine Marie Holloway was closed. The file was marked solved and archived. The evidence was catalogued and stored. The story was told, but the lesson remained. Justice requires patience. It requires dedication. It requires the refusal to forget, the determination to keep asking questions, the faith that answers exist even when they seem impossibly distant. Catherine had waited 61 years, but in the end, she was heard. The silence was broken.